everyone. I hope you're fine. Here we are in our webinar. Thanks everyone for being here. Today we have a special guest. It's Verónica Frisancho. Hi, Verónica.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for being here. Verónica, I will introduce our guest. Verónica Frisancho is the chief economist of CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America. Before joining CAF, Verónica worked for more than 10 years as a lead economist in the research department of the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank. Verónica's work can best be described as applied microeconomics, and her main field of specialization is development economics. Her research in these areas includes an emphasis on education, labor markets in developing countries, gender, inclusion, and financial education. Verónica has a PhD in economics from Pennsylvania State University and a BA in economics from Universidad del Pacifico in Lima, Peru. Okay. Verónica, the paper. 1 minute.
Yes.
Let me see. I just have to see the. Verónica today, she will present a very interesting working paper that I saw in La Ceia, and I like it very much. The working paper is, does gender and sexual diversity lead to greater conflict in the school? So Verónica, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lorena. Thanks for the introduction and especially thanks for the invitation. I think it's the first academic talk that I give under this new position. So I need to do a good job more than ever. Reputationally, I guess it's important. I'm now based in Argentina. As Lorena told you, I became the chief economist at CAF, and I'm sitting in the office in Argentina. So please stay in touch in this new adventure. So what this paper tries to deal with is what happens when two different groups interact a little bit more or are exposed to each other in a greater propensity. And the main motivation is that whenever you have diversity in gender identity and sexual orientation in society, that tends to challenge traditional institutions, traditional social norms, and gender stereotypes. We're in our societies, at least, some of the countries in the region, it's very common that we have labels attached to men and women, and we have this binary way of classifying people depending on their biological sex. But with the increasing visibility of diversity in terms of gender and sexual orientation, there is space for more tension within society. And that implies that greater representation or greater visibility of the LGBTQ plus population may lead or could be linked to greater intergroup conflict, because there is this challenge of values from part of the group that is non-LGBTQ plus. We focus particularly on adolescents. We think this is a very important stage. First, because it's a key developmental stage in terms of constructing an individual identity, developing personalities, and it's a stage in which most of us, all of us, experiment a lot with new things and new roles and new identities. It's also important because given this stage, the secondary education system, which is where kids spend most of their time during the day, are going to become crucial to reduce social distance in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of race, but also in terms of gender identity and sexual orientation. So the role of schools is going to be crucial in terms of generating more equal more equal societies. Third, it is true, and we have some data for the region, unfortunately not a lot, more for other regions in the world, but we do know that exposure to bullying and cyberbullying is very much increased during adolescence relative to infancy or puberty stages. Of course, now the limit between puberty and adolescence is changing quite fast, and it's becoming pre-teens are becoming teens very, very early, and it's extending to this stage, the phenomenon of bullying. But we also cover part of the sample in younger ages. So in particular, what this paper does is ask this question: does greater classroom diversity in terms of gender identity and sexual orientation affect violence levels at school? And violence understood under very general meaning, which could be psychological violence, physical violence, but also sexual violence. What we use as the main identification strategy is the fact that even though kids and parents choose a school and the choice is managed through a centralized admission system, the selection into classrooms within a school is plausibly exogenous, and that allows us to exploit the variation in the share of LGBT students in each classroom. What we know, there's nothing written on this, but what we know from our conversations with the Ministry of Education in Uruguay, which is where this paper takes place, once the kids are admitted to school, then principals or teachers in charge of this task assign kids to classrooms, and it's not following any particular criteria in terms of performance or the specific characteristics. They all search gender balance across classes. So it's not that they put all the girls in one classroom and all the boys in the other one. So there's some attention to biological sex in that respect. But we argued that kids are not being placed in classrooms according to their LGBTQ identities. And in fact, even if they're observable, they don't matter in terms of the assigning criteria that the principals have. Now, the literature that we think is related to this paper comes from two different streams of papers. The first one, which dates back to Allport 1954, is the contact hypothesis. This hypothesis basically states that, or proposes that, interactions reduce prejudice and discrimination because approximation between two different people being different in terms of race or religion or whatever is gonna generate more knowledge about each other, and that's gonna reduce the fear or the threat that the different one can have on the rest of the groups. These contact hypothesis has been tested mostly in terms of interrace conflicts. There's not a lot of evidence, but there is some papers that study the effect of having increased contact with gays and lesbians. And what they find is that this contact is usually linked to more favorable attitudes towards these groups. On the other extreme is the integrated threat theory, which is a bit more recent in terms of its postulation. And what it says is that closer interactions between what they call an in-group and an out-group are gonna exacerbate perceptions of threats to the status quo. Part of the logic behind this theory is that the in-group is larger and the out-group represents a threat in terms of what is the status quo in the in-group. So think about white population in the US versus Black population. So in fact, the focus of these integrated threat theory papers is on racial issues, mostly in the US. And what they find is that whenever there are closer interactions between whites and Blacks in the society, there is an increase in conflict and violence. There are very, very few experimental papers that are going to try to exogenize the contact that people from different groups are going to have. And what they do, these few papers, is they're going to increase exposure to an outgroup experimentally, but for a very short period of time or for a very specific task. Like, let's sit in a workshop for an hour or something like that. What we do is go one step further than this literature, and we exploit quasi-random variation in sustained exposure to LGBTQ students in a real life setting. And we highlight the sustained part of it because it's school. Kids spend most of their day with these people, with these other peers. They take the same classes in the same classroom. It's not like in the US where you kind of change classmates depending on the course that you're taking during the day. In Latin America and in Uruguay in particular, you spend the day with your classroom and they become your peer reference group. So that's why we highlight the sustained exposure part, which is not something that has been done in an experimental way. I forgot to say that you can interrupt me whenever you feel like it. I think I will have the chat window popping up if you decide to write a question, but you can also jump in and interrupt me if something is not clear. So a little bit about the context. Uruguay is one of the most friendly countries in terms of gay marriage, civil rights for LGBTQ. In all the scales, it's ranked at the very top. It's also very friendly in terms of gender laws, gender supportive laws. So, for example, it's one of the few countries where unilateral divorce is possible within Latin America. It's only 4 countries. It's unbelievable. But still, like in all the countries in the world, there's still some prejudice against the group of LGBTQ+. And in fact, more than 40% of Uruguayan students have heard homophobic comments, and they claim that no one intervened whenever they heard those interactions. Now, there's a national institution called the National Public School Administration, ANEP for its name in Spanish, that is basically focusing on protecting human rights in school. And it was a very broad mandate at the beginning, but in the last few years, before the new government, of course, it was focusing a lot more on LGBTQ, on migrant populations that were arriving into Uruguay. The Black population in Uruguay was very, very small, but in recent years, it increased a lot, and it started to raise a lot of issues in terms of tolerance and human rights in the school. So ANEP tried to kind of do some research in that respect, and that is when we come in. In 2019, they did a survey to characterize school climate for what they are calling minority students, and the focus was placed on LGBT students. And I'm going to start saying LGBT because we only had questions that allow us to arrive up to there in the acronym. They also focus on students that were migrants as a whole, irrespective of their race, because they were considered a minority, and students with some kind of disability. Now, the sample for this survey.
Veronica,
yes,
can I ask
you
something? You said migrants.
Yes, but these are, they had a focus on these 3 different populations, and they asked this question separately in the survey instrument. Okay. We focus only on one dimension, on the minorities they were interested in, which is LGBT.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
We surveyed 95 middle and high schools in Uruguay. We covered the middle and the high school levels, so that we stratify by that school level, by secondary level. And then within those 2 groups, we picked a random sample of schools. And within each school, we chose up to 4 classes per school, 2 in middle school and 2 in high school. The final sample of classes was 365, which gives us an average of about 3.8 classes per school. And the survey covered a total of 5,900 students. Now here comes one of the catches that I was mentioning at the beginning with reacting to Lorena's idea of replicating this in Brazil. We decided to do a self-administered survey that was anonymous and that was enter in each student's own personal computer, because in Uruguay, the program What Laptop Per Child really worked. Every student has a laptop at the secondary level at least. And we decided to go down this route because that was going to guarantee the safety, the anonymity, and the confidentiality of the sensitive questions that we were going to include in the questionnaire. We ask them about their socio-demographic characteristics, their perceptions about school climate, their experiences of violence of the 3 types I mentioned at the beginning: physical, psychological, and sexual. And we also asked about their gender identity, sexual orientation, and sexual attraction. The downside of this, and I say it now because I know you're going to have great ideas about additional data sources from the school side, is that we couldn't link the survey to admin records from the Ministry of Education. So we cannot link this information to grades or absences or any other admin records that you can think of. It would be very useful, but that was something we had to, a big trade-off we had to face, because we couldn't have the survey with identifiers to do that link with the technology we have. It could be done in different ways, but we couldn't at that point. Now, what is our definition of LGBT? As I was telling you before, we try to cover 3 different dimensions. Here we follow gold standards from countries around the world that have a lot more experience asking about these identities. We asked first about their gender identity. And of course, the options you can see in the 3rd column are going to be male, female, but also trans female, trans male, and other. And of course, we also have the additional alternatives of unsure and prefer not to respond for every single category, or every single question. We also ask about sexual orientation. Which of the following options best describes your sexual orientation? And here comes concepts that are more well known, I would say: bisexual, gay, straight, lesbian, or other. And again, the options for unsure, do not understand, prefer not to respond. Finally, we ask them about their sexual attraction, and it could be towards women, men, both, or other. We combine the information of these 3 different questions, not to be reductionist, not to convert something so rich and diverse into a binary indicator, but just to be able to be the most inclusive possible when trying to tag someone as part of the group. So what we do is we generate a dichotomic variable, a dummy, that is equal to 1 whenever the student declares a non-cisgender identity in the first question, a non-heterosexual identity in the 2nd question, or whenever he's attracted to someone that is not from the opposite sex, or to both, as one of the alternatives has. Given that, this is how the sample distributes in that respect. 18% of the students in our sample are going to identify as non-heterosexual or non-cisgender. This is already showing you the dummy that groups the 3 different questions. Not surprisingly, because this seems to be a pattern common around the world, and particularly at this age group, the share of LGBT students is larger among girls than among boys. It's twice as large, in fact, 24% versus 12%. And we find a small difference by level, which is something that we were surprised by, because you can imagine that the older the student gets, the more aware about their identity, or the more settled is that identity that they have been discovering throughout time. But in general, what we find is that the share of students in middle school that identifies as LGBT is 18%, while in high school it's only 19.6%. It's not that big of a difference. The bars below show you that most of the dummy is driven by sexual orientation, not so much by gender identity, sexual orientation and sexual attraction. And there could be coincidences for the same student in these last two ones, or maybe even across the three ones. Now, the other key variable in our context is violence itself, the experience of violence. And this is the individual experience of violence as reported by the student. We also have three indicator variables for this particular outcome. The first one is psychological violence, which includes verbal aggression, rejection, dissemination of sexual related rumors, videos, or photos. So it includes a little bit of the cyberbullying that we were discussing at the beginning. Physical violence is going to imply contact aggression, such as pushing, hitting, kicking, or being threatened with weapons or with similar objects. And sexual violence is going to be mostly lewd comments or gestures. It's not so much driven by non-consensual touching of intimate parts or sexual acts without consent. There is a very, very tiny proportion of those two that is explained in the dummy on sexual violence. And we construct an overall indicator variable that groups all these three indicator variables that we call any type of violence. Okay, so getting into the identification strategy. So basically what I was trying to claim at the beginning is that we say that the distribution of students across classrooms is going to be quasi-random. Allocation of students to schools is regulated by a centralized mechanism that can generate sorting, of course, and self-selection into schools. But the selection into classes within a school is not going to be driven by any particular criteria. And that is what explains our identification strategy. We claim that the share of LGBT students in the classroom is plausibly exogenous. And what we have here is one of the checks that we conduct. We basically have every column as the result of a regression of the variable in the column on the share of LGBT, to see what's the correlation between these two. And we see that the share of LGBT in the classroom is very much uncorrelated with most of the variables that we use that describe the socioeconomic characteristics of the students. There's a little bit of correlation with the asset index that we construct and a smaller one with the migrant status. But in general, I don't think, I don't have it in this table, but in general, the joint significance of all these variables tells us that we're kind of safe saying that the share of LGBT students is not correlated with pre-treatment characteristics. In panel B, we have the same thing. It's just that we split. Yes.
Just 1 minute. Sorry to interrupt. Marcela raised her hand. Marcela, do you want to?
Yep.
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. So could you just talk a little bit more about the centralized system for the allocation of students? And the other question is, like, you are also considering middle school, and then, like, just to give a sense, like, how much of these kids already have know their sexual orientation at this age, like for the younger ones? Like,
talk a little bit good about questions. Yeah, so the centralized mechanism, as far as I understand, it doesn't take into account preferences of the parents, in the sense that other systems allow you to rank sorry, I'm not explaining this right. What I meant is this system doesn't take into account an exam or any other criteria to rank students. It does take into account the preferences of the parents or the kids, but then it's basically that you enter the allocation system, and the allocation system returns an outcome. I think the ordering or the ranking of students, that's something we're still trying to confirm, because Googling this hasn't helped. Talking to the ministry became more difficult once the project was over. But it's related to neighborhood criteria, having a brother or sister in the school. It has nothing to do with performance. So in that sense, it's centralized, but preferences still matter in the allocation mechanism. It occurs at the beginning of each level, primary, middle school, and high school. Now, yeah, if the kids know or don't know their identities, I think that's part of the reason we included these options, these additional alternatives, being unsure or prefer not to respond, but also particularly here where you have concepts that are probably more complex to understand. We have the does not understand option. This should give you an idea if they are really like answering whatever or just being completely confused. We don't find that this is representing a lot of the percentage of the answers. There is evidence from the rest of the world, because this is not a survey that was done before in Uruguay, that kids, particularly in the US, we've seen that kids as early as 8 or 9 or 10 years old are starting to be more aware of their gender identity and sexual orientations. They maybe don't have like the ability to put a label on it or perfectly define it, but they are aware that something that doesn't correspond necessarily with their biological sex is present in their identities. There is not really a way to test it through a self-reported survey. I think we would need more exercises, more qualitative work, in fact, to do in-depth interviews or focus groups or things like that, to really get at the bottom of your question and know if there's like a cutoff age in which you can be safe to ask this question with actual answers that have a meaning. But it's a very hard thing to show to you or to prove to you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and do you have an idea, like in the centralized system, if after the system, like parents can request to change for some reason, like just the rate, just to understand like how this preference?
Yeah. I mean, it's similar to any other system. So I worked a lot on experiments in the Mexican system as well. And they also had a very rigorous centralized mechanism. But of course, if there's some, for example, the biggest changes that occurred in the Mexican system was my kid got allocated to a classroom that is on the second floor, but he has a disability. Can you please move him to the first floor? It could be that bullying is also a reason to change classrooms. It could be that there is a movement throughout the year when the kids are assigned to classrooms at the beginning of the year. But it's we claim, unfortunately we don't have that. We claim from our conversations with the ministry at the beginning that there's not a lot of churning across classrooms throughout the year. Thanks for the questions. Yeah. Okay, so the empirical strategy given our identification strategy is quite simple. We're going to have as an outcome variable the different violence dummies that I described earlier, and we're going to regress that on the leave one out share of LGBT peers. And we can use, and we actually see both the global share of LGBT students or the share of female LGBT students and male LGBT students. We include a lot of individual controls under the matrix X. Of course, we add grade and school fixed effects, and we cluster errors at the school level. The main effect, or the effect that I'm going to be showing you in the tables that come, is going to be beta 1, which is the within school effect of changes in the share of LGBT peers in a classroom. Now, this is the very first main table. I think it's the main table of the paper, and we have different types of violence on the columns, and the first one is just grouping any type of violence experienced by the student, and the others are going to be the psychological, physical, sexual components of that violence. And we can see that in general, it doesn't seem that the contact hypothesis is present here. But it doesn't seem that the alternative, the integrated threat theory, is supported by the data. There doesn't seem to be a lot of correlation between the share of LGBT students and the type of violence that is experienced in the classroom. We do see that when you include the dummy of being a woman at birth and being LGBT, by our definition, there's a greater correlation in terms of experiencing more violence. And these two are groups that are considered more disadvantaged or more exposed and vulnerable to violence to begin with. So that is confirmed with the data, except for the case of physical violence among women, which is actually likely to be smaller. This tells us that there is no linear relationship between violence and the share of LGBT students, but what about a non-linear relationship? And that's what we try to show you here. It's basically flat. You can see the prevalence of violence in the y-axis and the share of LGBT students on the x-axis, and it's basically flat in the middle. There's a little bit of a positive relationship at the beginning, going from a very small share to a higher share. So that initial contact seems to trigger more violence in the classroom, but it's not that we find a very strong significance. In any case, if there is a relationship, it's non-linear, but it's not very strong. Now, what we do next is we try to explore if there are heterogeneous effects under the linear specification as well. So we're still going to have the share of LGBT students in the classroom, which is our main independent variable, but we're going to interact that with being a woman and with being part of the LGBT group in the classroom. And of course, we keep including women and LGBT as controls. And the first column is always going to include the interactions with women, while the second column is going to introduce the interactions with LGBT. We do this separately. And what we find in general is that, again, the main effect is not significant, but when you interact the share of LGBT with women, you do find an increased likelihood to experience violence, particularly psychological violence. You don't observe that effect for the other vulnerable group, which is LGBT students. And having a higher share of LGBT students in the classroom doesn't seem to be significantly correlated with the violence that LGBT students themselves experience. This I'm going to skip in the interest of time to leave more time for questions. And one more thing we do is we try to go deeper in terms of these differential effects that we're getting in terms of biological sex. It could be that there are gendered impacts of gender and sexual diversity, meaning that there could be a differential impact on women from the increasing share of LGBT students, but it could also be that the share itself matters differently whenever there are female LGBT students versus male LGBT students. They have different characteristics, different labels attached to them, different expectations about their behavior. So we split the global share into two. And once more, we find that the share of female or the share of male LGBT students does not have a strong link with any of the violent dummies that we analyze. But we do see that the share of LGBT female students, when interacted with the dummy of women, yields a positive and significant effect that is quite considerable. And this means that whenever the share of LGBT girls increases within the classroom, that makes girls themselves as a collective, not only the LGBT girls, more exposed to psychological and physical violence. It doesn't matter, again, that the girl is part or not of the LGBT group, but more violence is directed towards her whenever there are more female LGBT students in the classroom. that is not the case for the share of male LGBT students and the exposure of women to this violence. In that case, we don't find a lot of significance there, except for the sexual violence component, which is even reduced. So women in classrooms where the share of LGBT male students is increased experience less sexual violence. And if you remember, this was basically sexual comments, lewd comments. So it makes sense that whenever there are more LGBT male students, the target are them, and they leave women alone in terms of the sexual harassment that they may experience in the classroom.
Can I ask you something?
Yes.
This is for example, the minus 0.12, it's percentage point. How is the
minus point?
The results, they are, we can interpret it this percentage point.
Yeah, so here, so the share is net of the fixed effects, so it's going to be centered at 0, and yeah, we in the paper we do give you like a percentage equivalent number that I cannot make out of the top of my mind right now, but yeah, it's not an 18 percentage point change, because even though the dummy, the outcome is a dummy variable, this share is a continuous variable interacted with a dummy that has a different. Yeah, in the paper, we kind of give you like, if the share were to increase in a 1 standard deviation, this is the impact that you would get. We are more specific about that. Yeah, sorry that I didn't include that here, but it's all explained, or the magnitudes are kind of explained in the paper. Yeah. Okay, and the second vulnerable group that we had were LGBT students themselves, and in that case we didn't see a global effect of the global share, I mean, of LGBT students. And whenever we split the share by female and male portions, the results don't vary. We don't see a huge relationship. There's no significant link between the share of LGBT and LGBT students themselves experiencing more violence. Now, what we think that these results are telling us is that there's no support for the contact hypothesis, at least in this particular setting and this particular age group. There are a lot of papers that are showing that whenever the press or the media expose or make more visible LGBT figures, depending on how they are portrayed, of course, but whenever this visibility increases, there are increasing positive opinions about the group. We don't seem to find that. If anything, there is a positive link between the share of LGBT students and violence at low levels of representation, as I showed you with the figure where we had the nonlinear effects. In terms of heterogeneous effects, we do find that once more, unfortunately, the most vulnerable groups are girls. A higher share of LGBT students is going to be linked to increased violence, particularly psychological violence against girls in the classroom. And that is irrespective of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. A second result of the paper, and we don't want to make a big deal out of this last table that I showed you, but I still think it was important to understand the channels. We find that a higher share of LGBT female students is what really drives the effects on girls. When we split the global share of LGBT students by males and females, you saw that the male one didn't have any real effect. It was more about having more female LGBT students in the classrooms that was a driver of violence. We don't have a lot to support our claims, but we think that it could have to do with the LGBT status being partially observed. Like, it's not that everyone that is LGBT dresses a particular way or looks a particular way. So it could be that limited observability, but rejection of this group within the classroom leads to more violence to girls in general. I know that there are more LGBT female students in the classroom. I cannot tell them apart from the rest of the girls group. So I have just more violence directed towards the group of girls in general. Or it could be, and this can be an alternative explanation that that is present in other papers in the literature, that girls become allies. It looks that women tend to be more supportive of LGBTQ population. So it could be that whenever that share increases and they become a visual threat for the rest of the group, then girls as a group become allies, and that's why violence is directed towards them as well. But again, there's not a lot we can say about this channel. This is all speculative because we were surprised by the increased effect on girls. But the bad news is that increased contact here doesn't reduce conflict. In any case, it seems to increase it, and it seems to increase it particularly among vulnerable groups before, which are girls. And this is where I'm gonna stop. It still has my old email, so sorry, but the new one is Frisancho, the same, just caf.com. The website is the same, and you can find the paper there. And I'm just gonna stop here to leave room for questions.
Thank you, Veronica. So we open for questions.
Hi, Veronica. Very nice work. That's very interesting. By any chance, do you know if in the schools they develop any activity like a class to teach kids about like discrimination, so ever, like, and maybe you could see if there's some sort of heterogeneity by classes exposed to these classes? This, like, yeah.
That's a very good question. This ANEP institution, which was the one trying to support human rights within the school, they started to open something like peace centers, or it was a weird name like that. And they did it as a pilot. They did it in certain schools. We haven't been able to get the list of schools where they implemented this yet, but our goal is to get that list and link that to our data, because even though we don't have the names of the students, this is something that you link at the school level, and figure out if the presence of these centers in the past years could decrease or mediate the effects or lack of effects that we're finding. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
Let me open this here so that I can see you all.
Veronica, really nice work, really interesting and new with fresh results. And I don't think that I understood the last one result in your last table. After you, can you put
this one, right? So let me make this.
Yes, the one that you were. Okay. No, I got it. Because your main conclusions is the higher the share of the LGBT, the higher violence against girls, right? This is one of the main results. And I was wondering because this chair LGBT male against women line with the result in the sexual violence. This is the opposite that you find, right? Like the lower the violence, at least, because I was thinking that it was the whole thing, but it's only one, the heterogeneous results that you find. So, but sexual violence reduces, right? Against girls, the higher, is that correct?
Yeah. This is what I was saying, that our guess is that whenever the share of LGBT male students increases in the classroom, they become the target and they leave girls alone. And there's kind of a substitution of violence that they mess less with girls, and then they direct the violence towards someone else in the classroom. The thing is that we don't observe the opposite of that in the LGBT result here. So we can just report that there's a decrease in the violence, and we can claim that there's less attention paid to them, but we cannot identify clearly which is the new victim of that violence, or if just dissipates from the classroom.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Congrats, really great.
Thank you. No, and again, if you are thinking about doing this in Brazil, please let me know, because you can clearly see them. There are several limitations in where we can do, particularly the channels, and of course these are all self-reported data, and people are always like trying to claim that there are biases when reporting self declare information. So admin records then become crucial, and I think that's going to be key if you decide to replicate this in Brazil.
Yeah.
Okay, and maybe we will have different results, because the regions in Brazil, yeah, maybe we find different results among different regions.
Yeah, and that would be interesting as well, because we have a sample that covers different regions, but Uruguay is a way smaller country and very uniform in terms of their population and their beliefs and their social norms. So going to a bigger scale with differences across regions, I think that's going to be interesting, because the setting is going to be quite important, and that can only be identified when you have this natural experiment that is Brazil, with different states and different degrees of development in this respect.
Do you have the religion of the students?
I don't think we asked that in the in the questionnaire. No, we didn't collect that.
Okay.
I mean, we do have a lot of information that we're not exploiting here. We were trying to figure out how to do it, and we haven't yet. So violence can also be committed by different perpetrators. It could be other students, or it could be adults. So we have a lot of questions on violence that was observed, not necessarily that the kid experienced that, but that was observed. So that's another way to measure violence, coming from different sources. So that would be a little bit less subject to criticism, in the sense that it's not the perception of violence against myself, but what I saw happening to someone else. And that part of the questionnaire we haven't exploited yet. The good thing is that there was a survey about school climate, so it has a lot more of data on the interactions within the classroom and within the school that we still need to exploit.
Okay. Yes, in Brazil, I think we maybe have some heterogeneity among different religions, and maybe among race also.
True. Yeah, no, you have different angles here, and you could also do this like minority students paper, right? You can have the share of Black students in the classroom or the share of LGBT students in the classroom, provided that the allocation of students to classrooms is unrelated to those two characteristics. You could exploit both.
Yes. Okay. Is there any more questions? No? Okay, so I would like to thank Verónica. Thanks very much for being here. The work paper is amazing and very interesting. Thank you, and hope to see you in other webinars.
Yes, please. Thank you so much. And thanks for the invitation again. Now that I'm closer to you guys, I'm in Argentina, so a very short flight. I hope that we can interact more in person as well.
Yes, that will be very good. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, and have a very nice evening, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.